really excited. I feel like a kid in a candy shop tonight. And I have many talking points and questions, but I'm sure that our conversation will take unexpected sort of directions. And I think the first question really is maybe if you can tell us a little bit about how this project come about and the various steps kind of which brought you three in a way to collaborate on this Sor Juana adventure.
Well, I'll say that it started with a gift, which is, this, at my birthday several years ago, Magos brought me Primero Sueño. And it, it's not the easiest read, I'm not going to lie. But when I started getting into it, I think shortly after I wrote you and I said, I think we should turn this into an opera, right?
Yes, actually, I think this is about to feedback all this.
I know.
Maybe we can turn the volume down a little bit. Yeah, I mean, yes. My intention wasn't that when I gave you that book. But I guess because Sor Juana, again, this is a friendship that it's been there for more than a decade, and so through Con Alma, the project that you were mentioned about, I guess we get to know each other in a deeper level, writing music during this very difficult time that was the pandemic. And I guess through that project, I think I got to know Paola better. So right after the pandemic, the first birthday and after the pandemic that we came together, I thought it was like a nice read. Knowing Paola's mind and knowing how she understands things and how she envisioned things. And I thought Sor Juana was going to be like a beautiful mind that she would resonate with. And especially because Sor Juana is a mind, it's a character that, and Ronda will help me with this, but it's not, it's a very, very, very important for the Mexican universe, cultural reference, but it's not as well known as other representation of Mexican culture, just to name someone like Frida Kahlo, for instance. So to me it was a nice idea, and especially one of the things that I learned about Paola while doing Con Alma is her love for Mexico and her understanding of Mexican culture. I mean, I knew it, but not in that level, beyond the common ground. And Sor Juana is that. Sor Juana speaks to a very, very deep, a very, very deep idea and complex idea of what Mexican, what to be a Mexican is today. So, yeah, that was a.
Well, I'll just add to that, and then I want to go to Ronda, which is that a couple things. Knowing Mexico the way I did, I had always wanted to write about it, but it was never the right project. And growing up on the border is a very, it's a very unique reality as an Italian immigrant on the border, speaking, 3 languages and crossing, because at the time, many, many, many years ago, you could just cross the border. There was no wall, there was no, the immigration wasn't what it was today. And so that kind of fluidity, I think, is something that I had wanted to explore, but it wasn't until reading Sor Juana that I thought, this is a woman who needs to be told through multiple lenses. This is something I could do. And so then it became, this idea of co-writing, this, which you can only do if you highly trust someone. And then we got to meet Ronda, which was when we actually got to go, behind the closed doors of the Met on a day that the Met was closed, and you brought us to see, well, first of all, you brought us to really, you toured us, but then you brought us behind the closed doors, which was an amazing experience.
Right. And it occurred to me a couple of days ago that this was almost exactly 2 years ago. You came to the Met on a day when we were closed, and we did wander through the galleries, or the gallery. I think the Met at that point only had one gallery of Latin American art, and they were very tolerant of my going on and on about things like how paintings sound and how they smell, and what it's like to touch them. Things that my colleagues at the Met sort of glaze over and think I'm crazy when I go in that direction. And after we looked at things in the gallery, we went into the study room where I showed them 2 new acquisitions, things that had not been shown to the public yet. And one was a portrait of a nun, a young 16-year-old nun named Sor Juana de Nuestra Señora de Guadalupe, and another was a nun's badge, an escudo de monja. And we had a good look at those and a good conversation about it. I'll actually probably not ever forget the conversation we had around the nun's badge, because you both had this amazing insight into how very personal and personalized the escudos were.
Maybe should we tell them a little bit what the escudo is, so they can.
Yeah. You probably noticed in the trailer that you saw that the nuns were wearing these badges or shields over their hearts, and those are based on escudos de monja, or nuns' badges that were worn by certain orders of nuns in Mexico, and they originated in response to an ecclesiastical prohibition against wearing devotional jewelry made of precious materials, because it was contrary to vows of poverty. So instead of wearing jewelry made of gold or silver, they wore painted ones, so they're pictorial badges. And they became larger and more elaborate and finer as time progressed. And they were painted by actually some of the best painters working in Mexico City at the time. And we happen to have a really fine one at the museum.
Well, so that was the moment where, when we were looking at it, 2 things dawned on me. And I remember just feeling the weight of this, which is that this incredible portrait, everything in that room, all of it was told through the eyes of men. And it's beautiful, but it's like, what was she actually thinking? Like, we'll never know. Like, we'll never know. And then it just dawned on me what a gift we had to be able to tell this story right now as women, with the technology we have, with the capacity we have. And we actually partnered with NYU, because in that moment we realized that at the Met we couldn't actually obviously hang anything on the walls. It's a museum. We have like 2 hours between when it closes and when the audience come in to set up. So everything has to be mobile. That the women themselves could be portable, essentially portable projection surfaces, portable lights, portable amplifications of themselves. Everything could be, the escudo could be their personal tech package. And so we wrote to a friend at NYU who's amazing, and she became the costume designer for the project, and that's how we really began thinking about wearable technology, and essentially everything made out of recycled materials that could be open source tech, lo-fi, but hopefully highly potent.
I mean, we already have here so many interesting threads, including the sustainability of the project, which of course resonates with Sor Juana's own interest in nature and her kind of attachment to all sorts of questions related to nature. And maybe we can go back to that later. But maybe, I'm sure that we already sort of heard a little introduction about Sor Juana from Provost de Pico, and it's true that she's not as famous as Frida Kahlo, but certainly, she's not totally unknown as a very important early modern author. Maybe could you tell us who is Sor Juana for you? In a way, of course, building on both your sort of knowledge of her, but also the kind of acquaintance at this point which you have with her through her work.
I have to say that besides all the incredible work that we had to do to get to understand the piece, just as a starter, with some of the most incredible intellectuals in Mexico that helped us to understand it. I think for me, because I was the voice of Sor Juana in the opera as well, I guess my process was to, beyond what we're going to share about her, was like, I was very curious about if she was a mystic or an intellectual. That was my connection with her. And I guess because I prefer to go into the mystic side, just as a personal thing. And then I understood through reading Primero Sueño that her mind was incredibly complex and intellectual, and she tried to explain absolutely everything with reason. But then there is a part of the poem. I mean, and I have to say that this poem is the only one that she actually wrote because she wanted to. It was not a commission. So in a sense, is her truest or her deepest or her most honest writing. So there is a point in the poem where she merges. No, she doesn't merge. It's not nirvana. She observes God or the knowledge, or the big self. But she never. The soul never merges with the soul. It always stays separated, like in a Christian universe. But there is a longing that maybe she understood through knowledge. But there is a deep longing. So, in a way, for me today, my understanding about Sor Juana is that yes, she was an intellectual, but she was. I think there was a deep longing of something beyond that she understood through knowledge. So I don't know if she was a mystic, but definitely there was a very deep longing through her hunger for knowledge.
It's a mystical aspiration, after all, to see the face of God. So maybe she wasn't a mystic after all, but she had that aspiration, which is definitely consistent with mystical thinking.
Right.
For me, it's this, I guess, this totality with which she writes. She's, we went into a deep study of understanding the kind of identity of Mexico that forms this current Mexican identity, which is, of course, the enslaved black people of Mexico, the indigenous people of Mexico, and then, of course, the New Spain, and how these realities came together. And as we were piecing together the work, it felt like this contemporary response that we were having, which again was collaborative and theatrical and symbolic, could be fully realized through her words. And so that's kind of, I think, one of the things that I took from her was, I remember when we were beginning to write it, we came to this realization that we could not add a word. So often the pieces about Sor Juana focus on her queerness or focus on this and that, and all things that, quite honestly, yes, they form a life, but to me they're nowhere as interesting as the quest of the mind. And I think often, it's like that love affair, the love affair of the mind and the mind's quest and the quest for knowledge isn't acknowledged and isn't portrayed in its deepest sense. And so I think being able to go into that journey was so exciting. So that's kind of what I resonate with is just,
the mind.
The fertility of the mind and how often that's, not the thing you take away, especially from women and especially from women in the 17th century.
Yeah, and if I may, so when we were putting together the project, we had a residency in Mexico last summer, and Ronda joined us, which was crucial. All the crew came down to Mexico, and I remember one of the gatherings where we were studying the piece. Ronda shared with us how was like Sor Juana's time. What was her environment? What she was breathing. That was really amazing, because then we understood one of the things that I love about Sor Juana, just as Octavio Paz and or like these incredible writers, that they understand so well and they translate so well, in this case, what the new Mexicanism is back in the days, but also such a universal mind.
She maybe even more than ever now is an enigma to me, in much the same way that Mexico is an enigma to me. I mean, that she was a provincial autodidact with a prodigious intellect and deep knowledge of everything from theology to classics to science, and embodied in her poetry, but much of it is inaccessible to modern readers or modern listeners.
So true. We read the piece to each other out loud, and because we were really tripping up, and then we created an appendix for ourselves, because all of a sudden you'd be reading about Nictimony and you're like, well, why is she writing about Nictimony? Okay, well, Nictimony, was an owl, was raped by her father. What's the symbolism here? And so all of a sudden, the context clues that you have as reading contemporary literature are not there, especially if you're not like a classic scholar, which neither of us is. So really, we reading the book was a journey unto itself.
Absolutely.
I remember you saying very early on in this project that you didn't want to freedify her.
That was actually a mandate from the advisory board in Mexico,
Mandate.
right?
Yes, yes, and also, I mean, also because if you do that, then you lose her. We lose what she was. Like she belonged to a different time, to a different context, to a different longing too, I think.
Which of course raises a very, I think, important question, which is also part of the reasons why I'm so happy to have you here tonight, is this question of the voice of Sor Juana, because of course it's beautiful what you were saying about reading out aloud the text to one another. So you have a collaboration, of you both, not just as readers in your own kind of room, just thinking with the text, but really sharing the experience of reading and listening, right? Yeah. Which of course is something which, in the case of Sor Juana's voice, we can only do in this kind of indirect way. I mean, we have either reading aloud her words or having a performer singing her words in a show, but that's the closest we can get, in a way, to the sound of her voice, right? I mean, by reading aloud, by trying to listen to her voice, there's something almost frustrating about it, but also it's the closest really we can get to her. And I'm interested in maybe sort of asking you if you can say something more about this process of digesting, in a way, the poetry of Sor Juana, which is, as we were saying earlier, pretty intense and not an easy reading. I mean, it's something which needs to be thought about and really worked out in terms of the meaning, in terms of the implications, but also something very vibrant and vivid in the way in which you're talking about it.
I'll start by saying that we created an erasure. So, I mean, it's a 975-line poem, which, we'd have to do a ring cycle if we wanted to set all those words. So we did an erasure, and I did mine in English, and Magos did hers in Spanish. Then we came together. So I found a great translation by John Campion that's unfortunately out of print. And we began there, and then we came together and we began to kind of look at the symbols of what would tell a story. So we knew, for example, that we needed to give the audience something to hold on to. And so many of those symbols became figures like Nictimony or Phaeton, and what were the symbolisms behind these characters that could tell a story.
Yeah, and also I think, the way I see it is we took, we wanted to keep her words, those are Sor Juana's words, what you hear in the music. But we wanted to extract the essence of it to make it more palpable to a contemporary ear. So, and that's why it took so long, because we wanted to make sure that, and also the rhythm of and also, which is another thing that it was so present in the process, is that there have been operas on Sor Juana's biography. Some of them great, some of them not that great. And a friend of mine that actually commissioned one biography, Sor Juana opera on her biography, he said, make sure that it's musical, that because it's so complex. I mean, if you it's the way she wrote, and the rhythmic aspect of it is very complicated. So I guess the most complex thing for me was to extract her words and make them musical.
And then there was the added dimension of space, right? Because the opera had to occur in 5 different rooms of the cloisters. Each space has a different sound. Each space has a completely different feeling. Of course, it's time-wise not synced, so you also have to kind of understand, what part of the story we're telling where. and what the challenges of those rooms were and how the audience would experience it, both traveling to those rooms, in those rooms sonically, and then to the actual moment of, you know, what the soul, what the body is doing in that moment.
Right, and also, I'm sorry, you were. I think one of the because one thing is what we read, right? One thing are the words. So this is the piece, right? But what's underneath the piece? What informs Sor Juana? And to me, that's the richest part, because and that was the hard part to learn and to understand. And so again, I think, and we wanted to make sure that people had the experience of that beyond the lyrics, because the opera is in Spanish, and we decided very consciously to make it in Spanish. But what we really wanted people to experience what Sor Juana was experiencing, what she was listening to through the window in the convent, the chants of the slaves, the kitchen, creating all these new recipes, her own writing.
Also Ronda's story of the Archbishop, which
oh my God!
was
Yeah, you have to
maybe
tell
you
the story.
have to tell that. Yeah.
The story of the Archbishop. So I think it was, and again, I guess to put that together, the residency was so important, because we made sure to create a residency where everyone involved in the opera could get a little bit of that. So we had a Mexican shaman, or Mexican, I would prefer to say healer, from the Aztec tradition, creating a healing session. So like every single, and we actually had this residency in front of Sor Juana's coffin in the Claustro de Sor Juana in Mexico City. So I think everything, and Luisa Prosque, the director, she created, along with our choreographer, an incredible journey that it's really like you were in a dream, like in Sor Juana's dream. So everything is like very oniric, and don't you think?
Very much so. You know, I was struck very early on in this process that it was very much akin to a literary translation, and I wonder if that ever occurred to you two. I mean, as I watched you work, I kept thinking that this whole process requires enormous tenacity, but also temerity. And if there are any translators out here in the audience, you know, you've probably been told over and over again that it's an impossible task. Mm-hmm. You know, it's just an incredibly difficult thing. How do you honor the how do you honor the original? How do you not betray the original? And it requires a certain amount of temerity to tackle something like this. Mm-hmm. And you know, and even though you didn't translate a word of the text, you're still translating her voices. Right. There's more than one voice of Sor Juana, and you're even translating some of the silences, the things that cannot be said.
Right.
It was quite a privilege to have a front row seat to that whole process.
And the space of writing is also part of this narrative, right? Because of course there's a very powerful moment when we are reminded about the symbolic image of blood, you know, used to write. But then you were also, I think, very sort of brilliant at finding the right amount of words to be projected on the walls of the cloisters, so that, you know, people could more easily follow what was going on. And the interaction between these layers didn't really feel like, you know, super titles when you go to the theater. I mean, I think there was such a strong integration between the words projected on the walls, which really were part of the artistic
Yeah, it was like a further
project, right.
erasure. So
Exactly.
that was interesting, because we had the libretto, but we knew we didn't want, you know, you can't be walking and holding a libretto. So we thought, okay, we're going to further condense this to like what's the absolute thing necessary that you need to see or want to see, because you also can ignore it and still, you know, still have an experience. that could further elucidate something. And so that was an interesting challenge that Luisa put upon herself.
Yeah, because of course, I think the role of the director in this, of course, we unfortunately we don't have Luisa with us tonight, but she would be the other person, of course, alongside the many more people involved in the project. But the idea of finding the right way, or a possible way to stage this opera in that kind of space. I mean, you have already mentioned the word space, both as an opportunity, but also as a challenge. People familiar with the cloisters, that it's a very complex space to navigate. I mean, beautiful. But, one thing is to go up there and visit and follow the itinerary. And another thing is to imagine a processional opera taking place there with all that means in terms of moving people around. Of course, the artists moving around, the instrumentalists. We might want to say about something about the theorbo, and harp as well, and the way in which you have been thinking about the instruments. So this is, as I said, kind of both an opportunity and a challenge. And maybe we can expand a bit on this question? I
mean, so when we started thinking about the instrumentalists, we knew we wanted somebody, we knew we wanted to touch a Baroque, but a Baroque, performer who could do contemporary work, which is challenging. And then we wanted some form of kind of making sure that Mexico was represented, but also somebody who was comfortable in kind of indigenous practices. And so that list just got like, oh, there's 2 people in the world who can do those 2 things. That really helped, and then we called those 2. and we lucked out because we ended up with 2 fabulous performers. One, Luca Tarantino, who's from Italy, and then
Celso Duarte from Mexico. Yeah. And also very interesting because so when we were studying Sor Juana and the piece and the history, there is a very interesting musical thread between Mexican Baroque and everything that happened musically then to the contemporary son jarocho, which is the music from the Gulf of Mexico, not Gulf of America, Gulf of Mexico. Veracruz, and it was very interesting because to me that's the most is where if Mexico really put attention in that particular art form, the Mexican music can really move forward. Is the music that has more African influence. Right. So we wanted definitely to put that in the piece somehow,
And then I think just from like an ethnomusicological perspective, one day I think what's going to be really fascinating to think about 21st century practice is that you're looking at really different ways of creating music, but nobody really thinks about what kind of safe space do you need to create to include performers who read but maybe don't read totally well, performers who improvise. We have this incredible German choir, who does some kind of singing but not other kind of singing. And so we essentially, the reason to all be together for those weeks in Mexico was also to create a performance practice that could accommodate these, different ways of interpreting and creating music. And I think that's one of the things that I think I'm most proud of that we were able to create was a space of safety to explore these different ways of communicating through music.
But that's your DNA. I mean, that's what you do. That's national soul. That's exactly your DNA. And I think that's why I think this piece really shine through, because it's like so many different. As you well said, so many different influences behind each performer, and even for me, like I've never done opera before. So this director, Luisa Prosque, she's so incredible and so clear, and that it was so easy for me just to dive into the spirit and okay, I'm Sor Juana, and she directed me so incredibly that it was just easy. So I think it was it was the combination of all these things, and also having an incredible team. Even that, I received this email of one of my students at the new school, and he said, I was really amazed about the guides, the people that were, bringing people to because you need a timing, you need to be super aware of what's going on, so people can move from one room to the other, in a very certain way. And so everything was it was hard work, but it was just everybody synced into the rhythm of the piece.
And maybe this follow-up question is for Ronda, because of course she's very familiar with the space of the museum as a curator, and I'm wondering whether you can tell us something about how this experience has either affected or changed your own relationship to the space. You know, what sort of experience has this meant for you as someone who's there on a regular basis, and someone who's familiar with the space of the museum in its first role function, which is that of being a museum?
First of all, I should say I don't actually work at the Cloisters.
Right.
I work on Fifth Avenue at what we call the mothership. But I will say that this experience of Primero Sueño at the Cloisters has superseded all of my other experiences of that space, and also all of my other experiences of that poem, because I hear it. You know, it's been just an altering experience.
When we were creating, we did have a conservator with us in every single moment that we were creating, because of course everything you touch, mostly everything, is a work of art. So that was a really interesting experience, you know, and I think that was the main thing that we needed to also convey as a troupe, was that we understood where we were. You know, that we weren't going to run and bump into something that, you know, or, you know, project light on something that can't be projected. I mean, it was an enormous challenge that was, you know, a beautiful one too.
Bringing the space to life, that's, you know, part of what you did, right? I mean, and to think about the way in which the audience responded. I mean, I was there as an audience member. I think it was the last night of the run of shows, and I mean, I felt a strong sense of belonging quite quickly, and I felt like being part of a group of people who seamlessly got into the rhythm of the show. And I think the most powerful moment in that respect was the procession in the cloister, because really that's the moment when the audience needs to move around, following the rhythm and the melody of what the cast is doing. Yeah. But then almost inevitably they get into being part of it, right? But without thinking too much about it. There's no overthinking on the part of the audience. You just end up being part of this procession, and you feel part of the whole thing. And that's fairly unprecedented when we think about navigating the spaces of a museum, right?
Yeah. That's such a beautiful moment, and we wanted it to feel like a processional in Mexico, you know, like that you actually could potentially lose yourself and have, you know, some kind of a spiritual or mystical or religious moment. Right.
Many of those spaces are processional spaces, yes. or they were. The cloisters, I mean, really functioned originally as processional spaces.
So you bring them back to, you know, the kind of sort of original role they had. And so we have covered already a few things, and in the interest of time, I think I would like to bring up two more topics, and then, you know, I also want to keep some time for Q&As from the audience. But so we have talked about space, of course, we have talked about voice, partly about writing, and I was thinking that what comes to my mind when I think about the way in which you all brought Sor Juana back to life was this role of writing as a form of resistance, which of course goes hand in hand with, I think, your very important and compelling feminist take on the story of Sor Juana. Of course, the word feminist wasn't really part of the lexicon of Sor Juana, but I think you have very good arguments in what you have done to show that indeed she can be labeled either a proto-feminist or feminist, whatever you want to call her, but she's doing something extremely powerful about resisting forms of power. Maybe that's where the bishop comes in as an interesting episode in the story. But more broadly, this idea of writing and composing poetry as a way to find a voice, but also make her voice heard, even if that wasn't always possible. Because there's, I think, a very strong instance of silencing those sort of voices. And she resists as much as possible that form of sort of silencing her.
Yeah, I just want to remind us that like gender equity does not exist in any country in the world.
Right.
So the question of feminism, we all like to say that, you know, it's not important. It's incredibly important to continue talking about it, because until we get to that point, it's a continuous conversation. And that reminds me of that incredible moment that you talked about with the Archbishop. I don't know, can you tell it?
Yeah, this is a story that's recorded by the biographer of Archbishop Aguiar y Sejas, who was Sor Juana's great nemesis at the end of her life. And according to his own biographer, that doesn't mean this is true, by the way, but according to his own biographer, he was so frightened of women, basically, that he didn't want to hear the voices of women. He didn't want to eat food that had been cooked by them. He didn't want to be touched by them. If a woman walked across the floor in his quarters, he would have the floor tiles pulled up. So it's pretty extreme, and it's sort of I don't know. It's a reminder, and this isn't an original observation, that marginalized people like Mexican nuns at the end of the 17th century had access to public discourse through marginalized art forms like poetry. I mean, she really only ran afoul of the Inquisition and of ecclesiastical authorities when she wrote about theology. And when she was transgressive when she tried to critique a male cleric, having been invited to do so by another male cleric, by the way. So it's a really interesting dynamic, and to consider in light of what was considered transgressive then, and what's considered transgressive for women now.
And for anyone now, I think about, these works that are highly symbolic and that you have to really study to understand what she's thinking, what she's saying, what was happening at the time. But you take the performance at the Super Bowl last night, and that was a highly symbolic performance, I mean, you can look at it from all these different levels, and it's this incredible work of art. So I think often, when you live in these kinds of times, you create highly symbolic work that can be experienced in many different profound levels. And I think that's one of the things that really drew us to the work, was that you could experience it from a historical perspective of what Mexico was, from a feminist perspective, but not only that, from this extraordinary work of art that it was, that anybody, can identify with, the quest of your mind. Right? Yes, it's love, and yes, it's potentially motherhood, and yes, it's partnership, but it's also the partnership you have with yourself and your mind and what you try to achieve in your life, and I think that's what we all so deeply identified with.
I mean, this is a beautiful point, because I think that one of the outcomes, at least for me, and I'm sure that this was true of other people attending, is this sort of strong feeling of universality in a way, because of course it's a very specific story, very personal, in the sense that Sor Juana is writing a piece with a very strong personal investment, for sure, but she's also, of course, part of a cultural context which imposes on her certain ways of communicating. That's what the sort of rules of poetics and rhetoric from the time were kind of activating upon her. So it's very personal, yet inscribed in this broader net of constraints, so to speak. Then, of course, it's very local to some extent, because you were so good, I think, at bringing out some of the components, even of the musical culture of the place where Sor Juana was based, and yet in constant dialogue with many other stimuli. Because, of course, one of the beautiful things about this transatlantic situation in the 17th century is that all these threads come together, not without tensions, as we know, of course, but also with potential for integration. And then the result is that, even someone who has never been to Mexico, who doesn't really necessarily know much about the details of Sor Juana's life, I think you get this sense of universality and the universal empathy almost. And that was conveyed by all these ingredients. At least that was the perception.
I love that you're saying that, because it brings me all the way back to the first meeting we had with Ronda, when you were talking about placing that incredible work from Puebla, right? It is from Puebla. And yes, right? It's this extraordinary work that, now sits at a very prominent place above the stairs at the Met, which you did that, but you began by talking about this kind of crossing and what it meant, right? That was the very first conversation we had.
Yeah, it came out of it, having been encouraged to present the art and culture of Mexico in a global context, and not confine it to a single gallery of like things. And one of the things that resulted from that commitment was the placement of a major work of art from Michoacan, at the very top of the main staircase of the Met. So.
You're talking about the paint coming.
It's an object that represents a scene from the Aeneid, and does so using a pre-Hispanic technique and under the influence of imported luxury goods from Asia. So it's a really complex thing. And it was something that people in Mexico in the 18th century certainly were conscious of. They were conscious of their position at the center of these converging networks of trade and evangelization, and they were conscious of their privileged access to Asia. Something that Iberian Spaniards did not have. So it set them apart, and they were very conscious of it at the time.
I love what you said. Your own experience, because I think one of the beautiful things about, and also it brings the relevance of why we do this today, right? Although Sor Juana was like the first writer that actually defines what to be because before that was New Mexico, Nueva España, right? New Spain, it was in Mexico, so it's the first writer that defines this is to be Mexican, to have these three influences, Spain, Africa, and native Mexico. So although it's very clear in her work, and we try to somehow portray that in the piece, the piece itself is totally universal and atemporal. Because it's the ascension of the soul. Everyone has a soul, and everyone's aspiration is to move, to elevate yourself. So I guess that's exactly this cross about these incredible creators, where they find the right balance between being universal. Like, she never went to the ocean, and she wrote about the sea in such a beautiful, profound way. So what's the power of imagination? And to me, that's where we find the relevance of this work today, like the power of our imagination regarding what we're living, regarding our context, regardless what is going on in the news, is what can we do with our imagination? What can we create with our imagination? And so it's not just the rhetoric of the dream, and it's just like your imagination is a really, really powerful tool that creates realities.
This is also extremely fascinating because, from the perspective of a scholar of literature mainly, of course, the dream vision is a genre per se, right? From Dante, even going backwards and afterwards. So there's something almost commonplace about the vision as a genre where the poet comes up with a narrative and tells us that, they have been having this vision. And yet what seems to be so powerful about Primero Sueño is that she manages to make it fresh, original, very peculiar in many different ways, and that same freshness in a way comes through, I think, what you have done together. And of course, the place of the music, I guess, in this particular project is central. And my kind of last question before opening it to Q&A is really about how you managed to find the balance between the tradition, because you were, of course, playing, I assume, with the notion of previous traditions, and of course, the challenges of I mean, both of you are contemporary artists doing things your own way. And what Magos, you just said about time seems to be crucial here, because if we accept the idea that time is almost on hold throughout Primero Sueño, then the freedom of the composer, of the performer, kind of gets more power and more agency. And so, I mean, I'm curious to hear maybe about how you worked around this conundrum of finding the right music for the various moments in the opera.
I think we never think in those terms. I think I like to think about this, and for sure that's the place where we, in life and music, where Paola and I cross paths, because the way I think about this opera is like, when she told me, let's make an opera, I was like, I've never done an opera. I don't know how I'm going to make an opera. But then I thought, well, there's you put together different songs, and I'm a songwriter. So, but the way I think about it is like, ¿cómo dices tejer?
Like to knit. To knit. So like, like I do one line, and then I give it to her, and she continues, and then she gives it back to me, and I continue. So I don't think I've never thought about genres. I mean, it's been so many years that I don't think in those terms. You just want to tell a story, and in a way, the story manifests itself as you start writing it. And the stories call for different things, So, like, for example, as we were designing the narrative, which was all Primero Sueño, there were also nonverbal bits. And so the nonverbal bits would call for different things. So we would say, okay, imagine that they're in cloistered life. What are they doing? Well, they're sewing. Okay, well, if they're sewing and they're passing themes back to each other, maybe they're doing a hocket. And so like those are those things that become kind of a musical way of communicating. Or, if we're thinking about cloistered life, what happens when they look outside the window? And that was the whole...
Walking.
Yeah, the walking, right? And so it's just that we don't communicate in that way. It's just like voice memos back and forth, and like, what about this and what about that, and then just like a sound and then a sound back, and
That's fascinating. Well, thank you so much. So we do have time for questions from the audience. So we have a mic, I think, which is gonna circulate.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for sharing your experience in the making of the piece. I'm hoping you can speak more about the escudos, or the non-badges, and how you incorporated them in the piece, specifically Sor Juana's. Did you find anything interesting in your research regarding that object of hers? And then, are you performing the piece again in New York?
We have to. We demand that.
Yes.
Yeah, I think. I mean, maybe because you're the expert on the issue, and then you can talk about the technology out of it.
Yeah, I don't know what else to say about the escudos. It's thought that her escudo survives. I don't know if you saw it. It was excavated, and it's in a very fragmentary state. There's not a lot left of it. But she is, in portraits of her, she's shown actually wearing an escudo that has an annunciation on it.
Yeah.
Which is not exactly typical. And I wonder if you guys thought about that when you were designing the escudo or working with Andrea on it.
Well, not really.
The idea of an annunciation that you wear. They wore them they wore them over their hearts.
Yeah.
You know, as a kind of a symbol of,
With
their
that's
vows.
the pouring out. Yeah, I think what I mean. Remember, during the residency, we went to with this incredible curator at Museo Sumaya in Mexico City, and he showed us some escudos that they have in their collection, and he told us so many stories about the escudos, and one of the beautiful things he told us is exactly this: like they use them to protect your heart, which is the door, where the spirit, where you connect with the spirit. So in a way, it's like a portal, but it's also like a protection, but it's also a way to be out there in the world. So in a way, it's all what Sor Juana was, because yes, Sor Juana was an incredible intellectual. Yes, she was an incredible artist, but she also was a socialité. She entertained the aristocracy in Mexico. So she has also this, allure of being a social person, and they said she was very funny. So it was very complex. But anyway, that to say that the exactly. So they Andrea designed different qualities to different escudos for each of the nuns. So the one that Sor Juana was wearing, literally, it was the idea of pouring your heart out, basically.
So at a certain point, Magos opens the door to her heart and then pulls out this incredible fabric, and then she projects her prayer that you can see onto that fabric. So that's Magos's. There's two of them have actual projectors built in, so they would open their hearts and then you would project an image. Another would be a light source. Another was a drum. So every there was one that was a beating heart, which was a rhythm that we used to incorporate in the electronics. There was others that were secrets, so if you got really close, you could hear somebody's, you could hear one of the nuns' secrets. And then there was, they also had electronic backing tracks built into them. So they were literally, they were their own amplifiers.
It was actually, I thought it was just a brilliant insight into how personal and how personalized each of these escudos was, because the nuns chose the imagery represented on them. They weren't uniform. They usually had the Virgin of the Immaculate Conception at the center of them, but they were surrounded by other figures that had personal significance for them. So they're I don't know, yet another example of the agency of the nuns. They chose them, they personalized them, they wore them. I thought it was sort of brilliant that you almost immediately decided to use the escudos.
Paola,
Something, it just occurred to me today. I don't know why. The couplet that you use that doesn't come from Primero Sueño, where she's the bold adventurous.
Right.
You probably have this line memorized.
Oh my God.
Yeah, fuera. She's the bold adventurous. But anyway, it's part of a villancico, and in it, the Virgin Mary has a shield that she uses for protection. And it never occurred to me before, but in a way that shield is kind of the escudo.
Can I add just one thing which occurred to me when thinking about the escudos was the fact that they also basically work like sort of emblems, right? This idea, which of course is a very Baroque sort of thing, even more than just Baroque, but certainly very powerful in the 16th and 17th century. But this idea that through the emblem there is something about revealing and hiding at the same time. And of course, I guess in the case of the nuns, we're supposed not to be showing off too much over themselves, right? There's something about offering a key which can only be interpreted if you have your own key to access it, right? There's something about a code language almost which of course worked out so well in the performance because it invited us all to think about the possible meanings of these objects. But I think it's very interesting to think about these inner and outer function of these images, because again, they were portable markers of oneself, both covering and revealing. And this, this kind of tradition of, opening your heart either to God, if it's a devotional kind of practice, or to the other in a different context. But that seems to be exactly. Yeah. And then I think the other part of the question was about whether you're performing this again.
So we want to because, the cloisters have a very limited, capacity. And so many people wanted to see it, and it was sold out like in the first month so hopefully sometime. Yeah, so in December we're doing it in Mexico. So maybe you can travel to Mexico. Puebla to start it in December, and hopefully Mexico City. Then we're going to do San Diego. En Oaxaca, tenemos que ir a Oaxaca. Vámonos a Oaxaca. But we would love to present it here because so many people wanted to see it, and so hopefully next year we come with good news and we make sure that Enrico help us to spread the word.
Monica? Hi, thank you all for your amazing work. I wanted to ask you about the coro, el coro de monjas, because I think one tends to think about Sor Juana as this really solitary, exceptional figure. So I think the coro was really beautiful at the piece because it really made it seem like as something part of a bigger thing, no? Like she was part of a hermandad, like with all these monjas. So I wanted to ask you about that in your piece.
I mean, from one side, they were like, as Ronda mentioned, they are all aspects of Sor Juana's mind, but also the sisters, right? So from one end, we have Sor Juana's mind, but also what is happening in the cloister and the cloister's life. But also this particular, very specific ensemble is an ensemble that we collaborated with in our previous project, Con Alma. And they actually commissioned Paola to write something for them. And long story short, Paola ended up writing for this particular ensemble. And when we heard them interpreting Paola's music, we were blown away. They sing together since they were 6 years old, so they sound incredible. And also they move, and we wanted to have movement in the opera. And they are, I guess even Ciela means sisters, right? Something like that. I think it's something like that. But, and they actually act, among them, they're like sisters. So that was half of the, we have that there. So it just made sense to it was easy to bring that story with this equation ready. But also, I guess part of the process of staging was how to bring this idea of sisterhood with Sor Juana, because and how can Sor Juana identify herself in all these aspects of the nuns? So it was, and that's I have to give credit to Luisa Brosque, because I think she's incredible, and she really directed us in a way that we actually embraced that in a very organic way.
Good evening. Thank you so much for sharing about this piece. One of the things I was taken for myself is how you're using opera to bring life into the museum space and like this embodied kind of experience. And you mentioned about Mexico in this global context, and I would love to hear about how you found your performance practice for the piece and like bringing all the elements and the expertises together.
That's a great question. I want to start with it's so interesting because when people think of the word opera, they think of like this, I don't know, they think of a very, I feel like people think of a very specific period. I think they're thinking like 19th century, they're thinking lots of money, they're thinking of a specific thing when really all the word means is to work. And so I think like that's something, when I think about our practice, like I think sometimes it's I don't know, it's just like it's a much more open definition of the word, which allows us to progress into what we think the word means today. But in terms of the performance practice, a lot of it is honestly, we with the company Vision into Art that actually co-commissioned the piece with the Met, is the company I founded, we have a really deep practice in equity and belonging. And so a huge part of that is kind of beginning with creating a safe space for all the collaborators. And part of the reason to take everybody onto the journey to Mexico was to say, if we're going to embody these words, then we want to be able to experience this together in a new place. And what does that mean? And so it's also about time, you know, time together, time to create a practice. And then we have pretty specific access questionnaires that go out that ask people what they need in order to best create, whether it's anything from childcare to, so it's pretty deep. And then from there, we begin, you know, from a place of trust with Magos and I, so we're not starting from scratch. You know, we started with another collaboration that went well, and so then we went even deeper. And then when we have people with kind of different entry points into the work, it's also thinking about mental health. It's thinking about what does it mean to create a thriving environment for the arts. And that if, in order for people to bring their best selves, they need to be able to be seen and be heard and ask those questions. And I think that often that's why you don't get the kind of richness of what it really means to bring people together who have truly different kind of aesthetics or needs or anything to create a real confluence of language. And so that's kind of the practice. And honestly, it also comes from a lot of failure, because I think when you think about the practice of the 21st century of involving improvisation, often that just meant working with a great musician but not crediting them. And so you have this incredible practice of like, wow, that music sounds incredible. And it's like literally because you had this one person in your band who you just didn't name. And so also it's like about like thinking about contemporary practice and what it means to be transparent. And I did it too, you know, like in one of my works, I worked with this incredible improviser, not naming them, but not creating a space for them to really thrive. They were on a stage with Met opera singers and they didn't read music, but I chose them. But I didn't create a safe space for that person to thrive. And so what ended up happening was a really sad situation that could have actually been an incredible one. The problem is they don't teach you this in school. And so a lot of that is also just, you know, failure kind of allows you to kind of, you know, create and pave the way for hopefully a better way to create deeper expression.
The Cloisters is such a special, spectacular space, and it's a collection of different types of cloisters. And so I'm curious, because it's such an impactful space, how did it impact the piece itself? And also, you mentioned you're going to be traveling with the piece to other places, which obviously are not going to be like the Cloisters. How do you see the future spaces transforming the work as well?
I'll just start by saying that every time we go, it's going to be a new piece, which is really hard. The nice part is we get to travel to those places and be like, oh, let's scout and let's see, you know, how it affects it. But I will say the huge part of this are the designers. So we have an extraordinary sound designer from MIT who really calibrated each room. Each room created a completely different challenge. And I say only challenge because, of course, the beauty is that you're in this remarkable space and that it was amazing. But the reality is, in order for you to have a seamless experience where it didn't sound like you were literally coming into every single different theater, was that we had somebody, you know, with tremendous care creating a sound system for every single room. So, and the lighting and so that's the kind of, that's the magic of designers, you know, is really they come in with this kind of, you know, deep aesthetic understanding of how to create a seamless experience. But it'll be a new experience every time we do it. Yeah.
But it's good because in Mexico we have so many beautiful places. And I guess one of the I think the most beautiful thing about the piece is the experience, the processional experience. That's the beautiful thing that you actually get. So I think all the places, I mean, we really want to make sure that wherever this piece goes, it translates the processional aspect of it.
Thank you.
Question, if there is one, yes.
My question just, what was your favorite character or like quality of Sor Juana that you three found surprising? Just like the funny aspect maybe of Sor Juana, or anything that any of you three found. So I'm just curious about that. Because you always think of Sor Juana as someone a little bit serious, I think. So I think that's the general perspective a little bit. So,
You know, I mean, definitely yes. I mean, yes, that I mean, I'm sure because I read so many things that she wrote, and there's definitely an aspect of herself that it's just funny, you know. But I don't. I mean, I don't see it as because she was funny. She was incredibly smart, and she used that to make her way through her circumstance. You know, so she was smart enough to use that to entertain, to ask for more, to be published, to to have the permissions that she had. You know, like while the nuns were working in other things, she was writing and learning, and so I think she was. It wasn't. I mean. Yeah, I think it was not an aspect of herself just because I think she was smart enough to just use that resource to find her wings.
I think for me, it's I think she's very hopeful. You know, like I think that in these moments sometimes, you know, where we can lose hope if, you know, things are happening that are feeling out of your control. I know I said this to you both too many times, but she says that line that is, I studied not to know more, but to ignore less. And I think about how that is so hopeful. You know, that you know, we can continuously refine our intellect and our empathy, you know, to be hopeful and to act on that.
Yeah, she's very slippery, Sor Juana. I love the poem that was found on her in her cell after her death, where she says, "I am not who you think I am."
That's amazing.
I guess that I also like this satirical Sor Juana of hombres necios.
Okay, well, I'm really happy that we had this chance of talking about Primero Sueño with you tonight. It was very special. And I think Magos is singing Friday night, right, at National Sawdust. So, you know, if you haven't plans for Valentine's yet, that's going to be amazing. And I just want to thank the three of you so much for sharing your work. It's been extremely fascinating. And, you know, we hope to keep following the travel of Sor Juana around.
Yes, and also, I mean, if I may say, we recorded this.
Right, yes.
The album, the recording will come out sometime in the summer, so stay tuned through VIA. And come to celebrate Valentine's on Friday with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks very much.